Welcome back, everybody. It's another Decline and Fall interview special for you today. And we wanted to bring you on this channel a variety of people and guests who have an analysis of the situations facing us, which you will not find, of course, in your local beloved newspaper or on your local propaganda channel, shall we say. And so today, with a view to doing that and providing this wider viewpoint of the wars that mark we would argue, the decline and fall of the Anglo-American Empire, we bring to you Marta Hravyshko today. Marta is an academic who specializes in the study of the Ukrainian struggles in Ukraine in the 1940s. Particularly, she specializes in studies of the Holocaust and studies of Ukrainian nationalism and ultra right-wing nationalism. Its collaboration with the National Socialism and Hitlerism, and she is also a patriot of Ukraine, somebody who has, of course, defended Ukrainian statehood, but who has committed the terrible crime of accurately stating what units and movements like Azov and others are, who is behind them, and what the historical legacy of those military and civil formations is, which is something which is not allowed to be talked about in Ukraine, and is also frozen out of discussion inside the what I would call the bourgeois press in Britain and the United States. So, Marta, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Kit, did you want to state anything up front before we started the conversation?
Well, I mean, yes, number one, we are extremely grateful for your presence, Marta. So thanks so much for joining us. And I think it really bears underlining that in mainstream terms, Marta is very much against the grain as a Ukrainian patriot who is openly critical of the Zelensky government and the not even the rise of the far right, but the entrenchment, perhaps that's a better word, of the far right in Ukrainian politics, which are, of course, unsayable things even now in the Western media. And she has paid a heavy price for standing on the side of truth and justice. So again, we are extremely grateful that you're joining us today. Alex, would you like to kick off?
Yes, Marta, I'd like to begin by talking about Ukrainian statehood and developments since 1991, the implosion and end of the Soviet Union and the emergence of Ukrainian statehood. Ukraine, for the benefit of viewers who might not know, was one of the industrial and agricultural heartlands of the Soviet Union. It was one of the most economically developed sections of the European side of the old USSR. So the economic inheritance from that Ukraine had in 1991 did have a lot of potential, and Marta will correct me on this if I'm wrong, but had reasons to be optimistic about the transition to independence, given the strong economic development that already existed. But what happened after independence seems to have been that a series of betrayals were carried out by, in my analysis, the Ukrainian political elite and the Ukrainian oligarchy in collaboration with outside interests, particularly from London, Washington, and Berlin and Paris as well. But I would argue London and Washington playing the primary role. But Marta, can you talk a little bit about the background here to your view growing up in Ukraine in the 90s as to what the potential was, and your view as to where did that potential go wrong in terms of the development of Ukrainian statehood after 1991?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. So I must say that I remember this collapse of the Soviet Union and emergence of Ukraine independent state. And I was born in Galicia, near Lviv. And Galicia is traditionally and historically most nationalistic, I believe, region of Ukraine. And far-right movement, Ukraine nationalist underground movement during the Second World War and after the Second World War, the biggest anti-Soviet movement in Eastern Europe was basically there in this Galicia, Volyn, so where I was raised. And part of my family was involved, heavily involved in Ukraine nationalist underground, and they were punished by Soviet Union for that, by Soviet authorities. Some of them were put in prison and were tortured there, including women from my family survived sexual violence during Soviet interrogation. Their family members were sent to special settlements in Siberia. So I have both this, this background. So despite this very diverse ethnic background in my family, this part of story, this Ukrainian nationalist story, was the primary story that I heard during all family gatherings. So when Ukraine gained independence in 1991, so many people were so happy. Finally, we can build our own nation state. Finally, everything will be okay. We have so many factories, so many plants built basically during this Soviet time. So, but what happened next? Ukraine basically became a state where oligarchs of different, backgrounds basically became kings in a different part of Ukraine. And nowadays, more than 30 years later, Ukraine nowadays have 10.5 million pensioners, and among those pensioners, more than 62% receive the pension less than $120. Can you imagine how can one survive in these circumstances? And the problem is that every single day, despite all talking points or is an existential war with Russia, we should send our son to the front lines without any questions. We should donate to the army. We should donate to the drones. But every single day, we see corruption scandals. Deputy Prime Minister Chernyshov, he inflicted damage to Ukraine's state that costs Ukraine budget at least 1 billion hryvnias. And he wasn't removed from his office. He wasn't sentenced. And what we see, he's addressing proudly a recovery forum for Ukraine in Rome in the past days, while other people are sent to the front lines, and those who are not reluctant to die for this corrupted state are just labeled and patriotic. So basically what I observe, and just yesterday, media investigative journalists published information. They found at least 400 Ukrainian officials who bought expensive cars but declared in their declaration, because they all obliged, of course, to submit those declarations, they declared their price, as the price of the phone, for example, in order to avoid repercussions. So basically, every single day, Ukrainians witness these, corruption scandals, these, judges and, prosecutors who are living their best lives. Their children are in Europe, in US, enjoying their life, free from military draft, while working class men are hunted like animals in the street, put into the van, and undergo fake medical examination. And during this examination, they all are proclaimed fit to the military service, despite alcoholism, despite severe physical damage to their health, like tuberculosis, for example, like oncology, and they are immediately sent to the front line, especially in these hot spots. So many Ukrainians nowadays are asking question, what is going on in these, paradise of freedom and democracy, and why ordinary people must die for this corrupted state and for this corrupted government?
Yes, and this seems to be looking at this from the outside, that the class divisions that you're talking about in Ukraine. Again, this isn't something that is ever reported in the West. Is that what strikes me is that a lot of the slogans, like I remember the coverage of what was referred to as the Orange Revolution in 2004, and then the Maidan in 2014. A lot of the ordinary people who got swept up in that seem to have been motivated by a frustration at oligarch rule. Oligarchs that were pro-Western, oligarchs that wanted better relations or greater relations with Russia. But oligarch rule was something that created a lot of anger. And it seems that what has happened is that in actual fact, oligarch rule has been entrenched even further by the post 2014 regime, by the presidencies of Petro Poroshenko and now Vladimir Zelensky. And now the Ukrainian working class is being asked to die, basically, so that people such as the notorious Kolomoisky and others like him can continue to rule over what is left of Ukraine. It seems to be like a total, utter, like colossal betrayal of the Ukrainian people. So I wanted to ask you, like, given how badly the war seems to be going, and we'll come to your opinions on the status of the war later. What is your impression of like the mood inside Ukraine now with regard to their attitudes, Ukrainian people's attitude towards the government and their attitudes towards like what I refer to as like the press gang operations and things like that?
First of all, it's not easy to understand the general dynamic because of the martial law. So basically, all polls, all studies that are published nowadays, revealed to the public, must be not portrayed, but must be. So we should be very skeptical about all these polls. Why? Because of the martial law. Second, because of the self-censorship. Many people are subjected to self-censorship as a survival strategy. Why? Because today in Ukraine, if you put some unpleasant and critical comment about, for example, draft officers, about the mobilization campaign, about the corruption, the security service of Ukraine can pay a visit to you. And recently, human rights organizations stated that Ukraine judicial practice regarding so-called collaboration is, let's say, very problematic because people expressing their critical views of, Zelensky government or how he handled the war, for example, or how he behaved in the Oval Office, actually. So basically can be put on trial and face charges with treason. So self-censorship. Then, more than 7 million Ukrainians after Russian attack in February 2022 left the country. So they are invisible. Their thoughts are invisible. They are not represented in these polls. And another reason, almost 20% of Ukraine territories nowadays is occupied by Russia. And those people, and we see that many of those people belong to eastern part of Ukraine and south part of Ukraine that are historically more pro-Russian. They were not leaning towards the West. They were very critical about the NATO question and the very idea of joining NATO. So basically, they are not represented in these polls. But even despite all these, circumstances, nowadays, the recent polls show that 47% of Ukrainians believe that in the near future, Ukraine will be devastated, unpopulated state. And only 8% believe that in 2022, when Russia started its full-scale invasion. So basically, mood of people nowadays is moving towards, frustration. Because no one proposed the clear plan of the victory. Yesterday, President Zelensky in Ukraine parliament was asked when those volunteers, combat volunteers, who volunteered to the army in February and March 2022, historians, many of my friends, my brothers, my cousins volunteer on this wave of this patriotism. And despite severe injuries, despite suffering, several, surgeries, many of them are not allowed to leave the military. Why? Because there is the shortage of manpower. So the response of Zelensky to this question was, after the victory, in Ukrainians in the social media started to make jokes. So never? Because every single day, Ukraine is losing at least 15 square kilometers. Russians are advancing nowadays in Sumy Oblast and Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. So, and nobody see the clear plan. What next? Mars nowadays is denying Ukraine Taurus. Nobody wants to send their sons and brothers from European countries to help Ukraine soldiers. Ukraine infantry is running out of soldiers. There is a shortage of volunteers, and nobody wants to interfere. When I observe all these, fellas on the internet, fight for Ukraine, we stand with Ukraine, Slava Ukraini, Russia should be burned, Moscow should be destroyed. But no one from them want to enlist in Ukraine armed forces. And today, so many divisions, brigades in Ukraine armed forces officially accept mercenaries, foreign men, because they are interested in new volunteers because of the lack of those people in Ukraine, and they have better conditions than Ukraine men drafted by force. They have better payment, they have better social benefits, they have I remember I talked to one American mercenary, and he said, we are not like Ukrainian men. We spend, for example, 2 weeks in the hot spot and then we have a rest. In contrast to Ukrainian men are slaves nowadays in the army, and nobody listens to their demands. In Ukraine nowadays, we have the movement mostly by women, wives of those mobilized men or of those volunteers, who demand their men to come home because they're exhausted, because they are demoralized. Some of my friends, for example, who already fighting the 4 years, experience signs of PTSD and suicidal thoughts. But who cares when you don't have people to replace them? So basically nowadays, more and more people are frustrated. They experience anger, but they don't know what to do. People are making jokes about North Korea. So they compare Ukraine to North Korea because men of the draft age 1860 are not allowed to leave Ukraine. They are trapped for 4th year. So basically, can you imagine, for example, Russian rocket or Russian drone, Shahed, for example, hit some plant, and destroy this plant. So people lose their jobs, but they can't go to, to Poland, to Czech Republic, to Germany and apply for some jobs in order to provide some financial support for their families because they are not allowed. They are not allowed because they are mobilization resource. So what is going on in Ukraine due to this war and due to this, enormous corruption that still is persistent in Ukraine? Poor people are getting more poor, and powerful and rich people are getting more rich. Every single day we see, new cars. We see this deputy, this parliamentary member bought a, house in US. What? House in US? I'm in US. I know the prices on the property here. It's one of the, most painful question for people here because the American dream nowadays do not exist because people in their 30s can't obtain homes. This is one of the talking point of MAGA, and now they are, so concerned about this. And Ukraine oligarchs, Ukraine politicians, without business, without records of any, economic business activity, buying expensive houses in US. What is going on during existential war? So many people have so many questions to this government, corrupted government that is supported by many Western political elites, despite of all these developments.
Well, it does seem, Marta, that the London government and the government of Washington D.C. are treating the Ukrainian population with a tremendously brutal cynicism, because the way in which, casualty estimates vary, and there's a lot of propaganda out there, but it certainly seems to be the case that many hundreds of thousands of mainly men in Ukraine have been killed. Many more have been wounded on the front lines, and that this is a level of casualties that would be akin to the Western or Eastern Front in World War One. Now, the British government pointedly will not, I don't think, ever mobilize or try to mobilize its own population to go and fight in this war. Neither will the French, neither will the Germans, because it would be regarded as politically unacceptable to do so. But what I think has been done to Ukraine by Britain and the US in particular is to turn the Ukrainian male population into an outsourced army, basically, to serve their own objectives and to use the people you've been studying, which is the Ukrainian ultra-right wingers, the Ukrainian fascist movements, use them essentially as their enforcers to force the Ukrainian population into this war and to keep them there. And I think the reason why Zelensky can't specify what his victory plan actually is because I don't think he gets to decide that. I think his handlers get to decide that. And the victory plan is whatever it is that they tell him it is. And you referred to Ukrainian politicians buying houses in the United States. I think that's them getting a way out. Because ultimately, if this war continues and London and large elements in Washington keep insisting it must, then there's not going to be much of a Ukrainian state left if this continues on the way that it is. And I think the people at the top in the Rada know that, which is why they're preparing their exit strategies. But I wanted to get your take on the way in which Ukrainian national feeling has been manipulated by outside influences, and the way in which that this has essentially led to the betrayal of the great masses of the Ukrainian people.
It's a very good question, and I will start with the historical background because it's nothing new there. After the Second World War, many members of Ukraine nationalists, Organization of the Ukraine Army and Ukraine Insurgent Army, OUN and UPA, they ended up in the West. And for example, in the American zone of occupation in Germany, and they were taken care of by MI6 and CIA. And they started to train them, they started to sponsor them, and they manipulated by all those feelings, national feelings, or, that they promised them that they will support their fight for independent nation, Ukraine nation state. And they, organized different covert operation. They sent them to Soviet Union, and people like Lebed, people like Yaroslav Sisko, they were Nazi collaborators, they were anti-Semites. And when we, for example, read the release documents of CIA, which are obtainable, they are published, you see how CIA officers portray them as bastards, as anti-Semites, as Nazis who helped Germans perpetrated Holocaust. But they were very useful. That's why CIA gave them money to establish Prologue publishing house, to establish, they gave them special permission, to enter US despite of their Nazi past. So they helped them all the time, and they financed all those, all those organizations. What happened after Ukraine obtained independence? Basically, U.S. government prolonged with this policy. They started to manipulate this question of NATO. And we know that they mostly worked with, people in the Western Ukraine because they were mostly historically anti-Russian, because they were for a long time part of, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Rzeczpospolita, Polish Republic, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Hungary. So this part of Ukraine was historically more Western leaning. And they started, to support all these NGOs there, and supported many NGOs and think tanks in Ukraine, for example, in Kyiv, in central Ukraine. They, USAID, Open Society, finance so many structures, and they promote this idea, you should join NATO because, it will give you this, stability and protection from Russian imperialism. But people in the east of Ukraine and in the south of Ukraine always were very skeptical about this because of them, personal connections with, their relatives in the Russia, business partners. But nowadays, polls shows that many Ukrainians basically nowadays, they are in favor of this idea of joining NATO. Why? Because of these numerous war crimes perpetrated by Russia, and because of this, many people are nowadays in favor of joining NATO. But what we observe now, we see that political officials, even Rutte, one day he said, no NATO for Ukraine, no Ukraine in NATO, no NATO in Ukraine. But then our doors are open. Despite the fact then that when President Trump gained his power, he was very clear about his position towards NATO, and we know that U.S. is the main player in NATO. So they still manipulate this question. They still pretend that they care about Ukrainians, that they care about its people. If you care about its people, send troops. Send your troops. Yeah? Maybe you don't want to have rockets in London, in Paris, Yeah? Really? All rockets will be in Ukraine? Maybe you want to avoid the nuclear war with nuclear power Russia? Because you know that Russia will be, if Russia will be, willing to use nuclear weapon, it will be used against Ukraine in the territory of Ukraine. So basically all these manipulations are very cynical. I believe that all these warmongers and hawks should at first send their sons, their husbands, and their brothers to Ukraine trenches, and then advocate what they advocate. It's unrealistic, I believe, NATO in Ukraine, because Russia was pretty clear from the very beginning of the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was very clear that if NATO will try to expand to Ukraine, it will be considered as existential and security threat. Yes, because of the Crimea and all this stuff. And even liberal dissidents, I will say, in Russia are very skeptical about returning Crimea to Ukraine. I believe that Russia is ready to use nukes to keep Crimea. Probably not Donbass, but Crimea is essential for them, not only for historical reasons. Yeah, Crimea was joined by, Catherine the Great in 1783, all these historical connections, not only about these, historical sentiments, but because of strategic geographical, issues connected to Crimea. Russia will never give up Crimea, and Russia will use its connections with India, with Iran, with China, Brazil, BRICS, and other countries to keep Ukraine in its sphere of influence. I can just imagine that Russia can build military base or train some troops on the territory of Canada or Mexico. I can't see that US government will allow this. So why you assumed that Russia will tolerate NATO in Ukraine, even without the formal joining Ukraine into the NATO? It was predictable. So many US politicians, so many US experts advised for a long time to US presidents, please don't do that, because you will have the war. And what political elites say, we are ready to pay this price, because the heaviest price is paid not by their children, is paid not by themselves, it's paid by Ukraine poor people who became hostages in this war of two imperialisms, Russian imperialism and Western imperialism. We can call it, by different wars. But for me, it's a very imperialistic view on Ukrainians. At first they said, we will, support you as long as it takes. And now, oh, no, we will not send troops, we will not send Taurus and all this stuff. We don't have money to buy weapons in recent days. Italy, France, Czech Republic say, and Slovakia, we don't have money to buy weapon in US for Ukraine. What? Where are your promises, guys? So nowadays it's so ridiculous, and I believe that war must stop as soon as possible in order to save at least sort of Ukraine that can recover, that can develop and build this, but it's also the problem what kind of Ukraine will be built, because I'm not in favor of ethno-nationalist, chauvinistic, racist state that where people, who talking in Russian language will be, harassed, beaten, and persecuted by language vigilance. I am not in favor of the state where Nazi collaborators are celebrated as freedom fighters. I am not in favor of this state. I'm not in favor of the state where in Ukraine armed forces there is a Nachtigall unit, and in Ukraine military tradition there is only one Nachtigall, formed by Nazis in 1941 to attack USSR. I'm not in favor of the state where will be the Medi unit that uses SS bolts and SS motto as an official symbols. I'm not in favor of the state where Luftwaffe unit exists, which is using Nazi eagle. Among all sorts of eagles, they use Nazi eagles that was used by Nazi Luftwaffe. I am not in favor of the state when people, babushkas, elderly women who pass, flag Победы on 9 May, celebrating, Victory Day, they put Soviet flag and they are put on trial. But those who use Derli Vanger SS insignia in armed forces of Ukraine are just, face no repercussions. But the law is the same for both Nazi symbols and Soviet symbols. Why do you have these, double standards? I'm not in favor of this state where Nazi apology is allowed in the Ukraine armed forces officially. I'm not in favor of this state.
Well, this brings up a really interesting point, Marta, which is the question of the survival of these fascistic organizations after they had been. As you indicated earlier, there was a 7 or 8 year period after the formal end of World War II where there was an insurgency campaign overseen by the CIA and MI6 and run by the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and others in especially Western Ukraine. And this came to an end in the very early 1950s, I think. But there was then a lot of these, what I would call the fascist cadres, were taken to particularly Canada, where the notorious Jaroslav Hunka popped up in Parliament. Perhaps more on him later, and also to the United States, where there has been investigative work done as to like the networks that they maintained there. But these were maintained all the way through the Cold War, and then it seems that they were by Britain, Canada, and the US taken them back into Ukraine to reestablish themselves after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. So there's a long-term collaboration there and a long-term project which the Western powers have been involved with. And my interpretation of this has been that the war that broke out in 2022, the politicians themselves might have said they didn't want it, but various people who are within the state mechanisms of Britain and the United States did want it. They thought that they had a way to victory that involved using Ukraine with the fascist groups enforcing the discipline to, if not defeat Russia on the battlefield, because that might not have ever been possible, but to combine that with the sanctions regime and to secure a palace coup or a political collapse inside Moscow itself. So this seems to have been the very cynical plan that they developed there, and that they had the reason why they kept all of these Ukrainian fascistic organizations essentially on the payroll for a good 50 years before their plan was finally put into action. Kit, I don't know if you wanted to add anything onto that question there, because I know you've done quite a lot of the reporting.
Well, yeah, I mean, and a large number of questions, important points do arise from this. I found your answers fascinating, Marta. In 1957, the CIA produced a report, which has since been declassified, called "Resistance Factors" in Ukraine, and it mapped out Ukraine by regions, and it rated their the likelihood of these regions to support some kind of Western incursion into the Soviet Union, and what areas would support effective war against the Soviet Union, and where there were still kind of remnants of the union of fascists and militants who could be mobilized for the purpose. This was predominantly centered around Lvov and Galicia, of course. And then, we fast forward to Maidan, and all of the areas that were tagged by the CIA in 1957 as being most likely to support some kind of Western incursion into the Soviet Union, supported Maidan, and the areas, including Crimea, which were judged to be highly resistant to such an effort, opposed Maidan. So there's quite an interesting historical parallel there. On the question of continued support for kind of fascist or like ultra-nationalist movements, I mean, from my perspective and based on my understanding, I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on this. It seems to me that, yes, these networks never ever vanished. They at best kind of escaped to other countries and lay in wait while still being sponsored by the CIA and MI6. Is it the case that since 1991 these forces have returned to Ukraine with Western sponsorship?
Thank you so much. So, what is very interesting, when people say to me, they reference to the Jewishness of Zelensky in order to justify this mantra, there are no Nazis in Ukraine, because 73% of Ukrainians voted for Zelensky knowing very well his Jewish background. So basically, the majority of Ukrainians are not anti-Semite. And I believe it's true. Majority of Ukrainians are not anti-Semites, but they are not in power. those who have power in Ukraine now, basically, I mean, these far-right groups who are empowered by the state and by the state actors are basically anti-Semites. And when so today, basically, I'm in favor of the idea, and this is one of my most important takes, that far-right in Ukraine nowadays are supported by the state directly, and not only by the state, but by President Zelensky himself and his team. Why I'm saying that? Let's take Azov movement. It's not just Azov regiment that was established in 2014. Nowadays, we have Azov regiment in National Guard. It's a 12th brigade. Then, in order to rebrand them, they took after 22, because of this image in Western media, bad image, they were trying to rebrand them, to whitewash them. So they took the most radical elements and established the 3rd Assault Brigade, led by Andriy Bieletsky himself. And Andriy Bieletsky is a leader of, former leader of, Patriot of Ukraine, racist organization that held many hate crimes against ethnic minorities in Kharkiv. He publicly supported Ratko Mladic and Srebrenica and called him national hero. He publicly said different anti-Semitic ideas. So basically nowadays we have Azov in National Guard, we have the 3rd Assault Brigade, we have Kraken, which is also based on Azov movement, we have Lyubar, which is also based on Azov movement. So basically,
Centuria too.
Centuria is, many people make joke that this is Hitler Jugend, and why? This is Azov youth movement. They accept both boys, mostly boys, but also girls from 14 until 24. And they have a great network of these Centuria and representation in different Ukraine regions, in most Ukraine regions, and nowadays even in Poland, in Germany, in Austria. So who are those? So they have a great network, and many of them are supported by different politicians, by different officials, including those who are pro-Russian, like Trukhanov, for example. So basically, in order to keep their power, Zelensky office said to them, "You should sponsor our boys," and they sponsor those boys. And who is sponsoring Azov nowadays? Pinchuk, yes, oligarch Pinchuk, oligarch Akhmetov, who by many is called responsible for civil unrest that led to this tragedy and conflict, in the Donbas region. Yeah, so he basically is heavily responsible for what was going on there. So basically, they are supported by different oligarchs close to Zelensky himself. And they are allowed to do whatever they want, for example. Yeah, they are allowed to schools, for example, with, hate tattoos over their body, with Darlivanger, SS insignia. They are allowed to school to perform, lessons of courage to state schools. Yes, so it's another sign why they are supported by the state. Also, this enormous propaganda everywhere, everywhere, films, ads everywhere, in metro station, all over the cities. Last year, I was in Ukraine. I was shocked. I had a street walk in Lviv, and 95 approximately % of big boards and city lights that I saw were devoted to Azov movement, mostly to the 3rd Assault Brigade. They are allowed to accept open neo-Nazis like Uragan Krasnoludsky from Russia, who is former Wagner member, who is supposedly, allegedly, was a paid killer in Ukraine, who is openly anti-Semite. Everyone who is following his social media can see his anti-Semitic jokes, and one of his anti-Semitic jokes he posted about me, about Auschwitz and about me. So he's the open anti-Semite. His friend Schulz is a member of a racist group Tasak and was involved in, hate crimes, killing of Azerbaijani people in Russia. Other neo-Nazis are also included, in Silver Brigade, and they are completely allowed to use Nazi symbols. And what Ukraine government did, they asked basically U.S. Department of State, I believe American officials to help them with this whitewashing. That's why, for example, the IDEA Anti-Defamation League completely changed its estimation of Azov movement after 2022. In legacy media, New York Times, Washington Post, The Guardian, they started to be portrayed as freedom fighters, as patriots, as just nationalists who are ready to sacrifice their life for the motherland, and de-radicalized and depoliticized. But what we observe now in different polls in Ukraine that are trying to measure political use of Ukrainian people, Bieletsky is included among those candidates for the presidency. Not any other commander, but Bieletsky. So Bieletsky is still pursuing political agenda, and he's the Silver Brigade. It's not just military elite military unit and elite brigade. It's a political project, and it's so obvious for everyone who is following them, and for everyone who is following their political agenda and their views. What do you observe, on Facebook, for example? Azov just turned Wolfsangel symbol and call it idea of the nation. And now Facebook is not banning all these symbols because, it's idea of the nation, apparently. U.S. Congress lifted the ban for delivering weapons to Azov. Despite of all this evidence that they are accepting and they're training American neo-Nazis, they were involved in war crimes in Donbas region, and they have hate ideology. One of their members last year went to Auschwitz with hate symbols on their T-shirt and mocked Holocaust survivors. And they say, it's all Russian propaganda. If you're criticizing this, it's all Russian propaganda. But their commanders are making Nazi salute. Some of their commanders had a clothing brand with Auschwitz University inscription, with glorifying Wehrmacht, with glorifying SS, and nobody cares. And it's not allowed according to Ukraine law. It's against Ukraine constitution, celebrating Soviet symbols. But as I told you, double standards. For Soviet symbols, you will be persecuted. For Nazi symbols, if you are a member of Azov movement or other far-right brigades like Karpatska Sich, who is using Totenkopf on their insignias, on their T-shirts, during their official war ceremony, they use Totenkopf. SS Totenkopf that was used by Panzer Division Waffen-SS that was guarding concentration camps. And they are allowed to do that. And those who say there are no Nazis in Ukraine, I'm receiving death threats from American neo-Nazi who is fighting in Ukraine, Argentinian neo-Nazi who is fighting in Ukraine, Russians neo-Nazi who is fighting in Ukraine, and German neo-Nazis who are fighting in Ukraine. And now those German neo-Nazis are officially included in Ukraine armed forces as a part of Carpathian Siege 49 brigades. And all those wonderful people are sending death threats and rape threats to me personally. That's why I'm cooperating with Massachusetts State Police and FBI in order to somehow protect my child and my life, because they threaten me that they will kill me, they will, use acid against me, they will do whatever they want to me. And security service here in US, because they are tracing this network, far-right network, they take all those threats seriously, in contrast to Ukraine security service and Ukraine military intelligence. And why? Because many far-right are led by Ukraine military intelligence. In 2023, in 2024, actually, it was Independence Day of Ukraine, the most important holiday, national holiday. And in Lviv, in my native city, there was a conference of neo-Nazis, official conference in fancy hotel. And who were there? Not only Ukrainian neo-Nazis from Azov, from Freikorps, from C-14, who attacked, Roma people, perpetrated basically pogrom of Roma people. Not only Ukrainian neo-Nazis, but also German neo-Nazi from German Volunteer Corps, Russian neo-Nazis, including Nikitin, the leader of Russian Volunteer Corps, who is banned actually from entering UK because he trained UK Nazis who are now, this organization is forbidden in UK. He's subjected to a Schengen ban from 2019 because of his extremist activity, because he's considered as dangerous neo-Nazi. And he and his deputies were on this conference, and Belarusian neo-Nazis, and Dritevek, which is neo-Nazi German organization, and Kazapound, which is fascist Italian organization. Can you imagine that during war, with all these national precautions, under martial law, this kind of conference can be held without supervision and sanction of security service and Ukrainian military intelligence? Nikitin and other people are directly subjected to Ukrainian military intelligence. Their chief is Budanov, the head of Ukrainian military intelligence. Can you imagine? We are losing territories every single day. We have had losses in the battle, but I will go to the conference. And why they held this conference? Because Ukraine is running out of soldiers, and they are attracting all kinds of neo-Nazis who are thirsty of military training, access to the weapon. And let's imagine what happens if the war in the near future, war will end somehow, sometimes it will end, and all these wonderful people indoctrinated in hate ideology, socialized in legitimate violence, with the deep knowledge, will come to their respective homes. And what will they do? They will engage in terroristic activity, and they will kill people, and they will attack people, improper people. I mean, feminists, LGBT people, politicians. And I'm sure that they will blame Western political elites for betrayal of Ukraine. So they will develop this stab in the back myth, very anti-Semitic, myth, because they already developed this myth that, globalists and, are behind, this war, and they are using Ukrainians and so on and so forth. So basically, they will seek revenge. And Western political elites are closing their eyes to all these developments in Ukraine. To my understanding, all units that are using neo-Nazi symbols, that are Ukraine units, I mean Ukraine armed forces, should be not allowed to have Western weapons and undergo Western training. Because in this regard, if they all have this, West is complicit basically in cherishing neo-Nazis in Ukraine. And how can it be possible in this world of never again ethic? We observe this, instrumentalization of anti-Semitism everywhere nowadays, or we should protect our Jewish people. I feel not protected, because those threats that I receive not from far left, not from pro-Palestinian people. I receive from neo-Nazis. and their supporters and their sympathizers, because the real threat for Jewish people is from right circles. I believe that in this distorted, world, we forgot the threat from far right, and we downplayed them and underestimate them. How can it possible? The German neo-Nazi whose chest is covered by different insignia of Waffen-SS and huge swastika is sponsored and trained by Ukraine government and is holding command position in Ukraine armed forces, and they have German weapon. What kind of never again ethic is it? What are you doing, guys? It's just.
Well, I mean, I think you mentioned that you returned to Ukraine, and I think you were very brave for doing so, given the criticisms that you have voiced. Because I mean, I wanted to mention on the self-censorship point. There is a Ukrainian socialist. His name is Bogdan Sorotyuk. He's been in a high security jail in Ukraine since April 2024 for writing articles critical of Zelensky and the far right in Ukraine. And you have the Dr. Ivan Kachanovsky, who's done an enormous amount of work on the Maidan sniper massacre, the Odessa massacre, and his property and home in Ukraine has been seized. He is persona non grata. It is likely he'll never be able to return at this rate. So I mean, you mentioned that you are worried about the security and safety of your children and your family. I mean, do you feel safe stateside? Do you think there'll be a time when you can return home? Because as you mentioned, there is when this conflict is over, and that's that's an open question as to when that will come and what that will look like. Already the British government in July 2022, I think, spoke of the risk of returning extremist fighters from Ukraine and how there was no formal system in place for British security services to deal with this problem. What's your feeling about the likelihood of you returning to your homeland?
First of all, I must say that I was forced to go to Ukraine despite all security concerns, because my mother was dying from cancer. And it was a very dramatic period in my life because we were very close with my mother, and she was only 60 years old. And I believe that Ukraine security service showed at least some mercy, in this regard. But I felt really not safe in Ukraine. I was trying to avoid public space. But I observed many issues in Ukraine. And I often repeat that, I live here in Massachusetts already 2 years in this place. And during these past 2 years of my life, I never saw swastika, Totenkopf, Schwarze Sonne, or other hate symbols here. Never and nowhere. No hats, no t-shirts, no graffiti, nothing. In Ukraine, in my native Lviv, during 3-hour walk in the city centers, I see swastika in the Holocaust Memorial, the Prostor Synagogue, the Sphere of Synagogues. I saw t-shirts with Nazi eagles, and many of them are connected to military culture. Why Ukraine government is allowed them to use these symbols? Because many of these clothing brands basically are established and belong to current military personnel or to war veterans. So they allow them to do that, and government want their empathy and their support. That's why they allow them, That's why in Ukraine, you see this everywhere nowadays. Everywhere. It's so normalized, and nobody questioned those symbols, and nobody questioned those images. So about my security. Another reason why I went to Ukraine was that back then I wasn't on Mirotvorets hit list. to our viewers, Mirotvorets is the Ukraine website that put the names and personal information actually about the alleged enemies of Ukraine people, traitors of Ukraine. Of Ukraine. This Mirotvorets, according to U.S. Department of State, actually, is close to Ukraine Security Service, and we can read numerous statements made by U.S. Department of State, G7. And on the website of UK government, you can access this statement actually by Human Rights Watch, by other human rights organizations. They express concern regarding this website. Why? Because many people basically are persecuted. Even still, Tulsi Gabbard is still listed on this website as a Russian asset. So they, in the beginning of this year, in 2025, after my return from Ukraine, they put my name also on this website and blame me for everything possible, treason. So basically, based on this, description and this allegation and these charges, I will face them, not capital punishment is not existing anymore in Ukraine, but the highest punishment for treason, basically, based on this description. And they put even there as a proof my academic article about UN and UPA and the sexual violence perpetrated by Ukrainian nationalists during the Second World War as a proof that I am a paid Russian asset and the, traitor of Ukraine people. And this is ridiculous. Everyone who will access Mirotvorets, and everyone can do that, just look at this evidence. They are ridiculous. I'm joking about far right in Ukraine. I'm criticizing naming streets after Nazi collaborators. I'm criticizing, renaming one of the village in Ukraine to commemorate, Waffen-SS Division Galicia. I am criticizing the exhibition made by Azov Desert Brigade celebrating Waffen-SS Division. And they using all these criticism, criticism, because I'm Holocaust scholar. I teach anti-Semitism and racism at Clark University. So I have credentials, expertise to express my judgment on all these issues. And because of that, they blame me for treason. So now I'm on Mirotvorets. And some enthusiasts, basically, what is Mirotvorets? Is basically you are putting the target on someone's back. And some enthusiasts can kill you, harm you, because they will believe to these, accusations. And as you witness in Ukraine in past years, we have numerous political terrorist attacks. We have numerous killings, including Irina Farion, a professor. Yes, she was radical. Yes, she belonged to racist Svoboda party, but she was professor and she expressed her criticism of Azov members for using Russian language. She blamed them for non-patriotic stance, for using enemy, meaning Russian language, and it was a public discussion between them and public dispute. And many members of Azov movement, they use very strong words when they describe her position. And basically, the person who followed Azov members, who followed other neo-Nazi groups close to Azov, killed her. It was just 1 week after I returned from my trip to Ukraine, and I was horrified. Because Irina Farion, she criticized me as well. She used against me these different slurs. She also targeted me. But you can kill person. You just can't do that. And what is the problem? That the guy who killed her was a Russian-speaking guy. His father is in Ukraine Armed Forces. And he felt personally, harmed by her stance on Russian language. And evidence showed that he followed different neo-Nazi Telegram channels. So basically, he was indoctrinated in this hate. So if Irina Farion was killed in Lviv, in her native city, in Lviv, where she is a star. So if Irina Farion was killed, what can happen to me and my child? I receive death threats on the daily basis. And I am asking SBU, Ukraine Security Service, for protection. But it's like, go to Gestapo and complain about Gestapo members. For me, it's the same. You can ask people because it's the conflict of interest. They use them, they instrumentalize them, they gave them free hand. So they don't care what they will do to the traitors of the motherland. And in addition to this, we have a misogyny and sexism. I'm a left-leaning. I'm pro-LGBT activist. They use against me my background, my ethnicity. That's why I receive so many anti-Semitic content that I actually use creatively during during my class on anti-Semitism online. Yes, so I teach my students how anti-Semitism can look like, what science could be, coded words, and so on. So words based on even on those on this content that I receive almost daily. So nowadays I fear for my life and for life of my son. And the FBI agents told me, make some precautions. Please don't open some unknown packages and all this stuff. So basically, the danger is real. The threats are real. Why? Because they are from those actors that enjoy protection from high-level members of Ukraine political elites nowadays, because they are highly needed by those Ukraine political elites in order to save their political power, to save their political future, and to fight Russians. Basically, that's why people like me are facing all these threats for our legitimate criticism of ethnic nationalism and far right in Ukraine.
Yes, and I think that this points out a rather, as you indicate, a rather glaring hypocrisy in most of the "never again" rhetoric from the British and the American governments, which is, it turns out, never again just means, well, absolutely nothing. When it comes down to it, it's just a phrase, because if you are going to keep many of the fascist organizations that existed in Europe in World War II. It's not just Ukrainians that were sheltered by the British and the Americans after World War II. Croatians of a similar nature, various fascist formations from places like Hungary and other members of the Axis, not to mention the collaborators in places like France, and people, of course, Nazi personnel from Germany itself. Were all welcomed into exile after World War II, and are kept around and kept in service. So, and it's not just Ukraine either. The British government has a record of doing this in, of course, the Middle East. If we look at, who runs Syria now, of course, this is a ultra-violent, extremely reactionary, backward-looking, sectarian religious organizations whose purpose really is to be simply the strong-arm men for the agenda of other people. And in Syria, that's again, main Britain, United States, Turkey, etc. In Ukraine, Britain, the United States, other some of the European powers. But I wanted to turn now, Marta, towards potential future outcomes here and ask for your thoughts on this, because Trump came into the presidency saying that it wasn't his war. There's reason to dispute that, but that it was Biden's war. He was going to bring this to a close. The showdown in the Oval Office between Vance, Trump, and Zelensky, which you've already talked about. And Trump has been saying he wants to talk to Putin, he wants to reach some sort of settlement, but there seems to be no movement on this at all. There was a plan presented by Trump that had the name of General Keith Kellogg on it. Kellogg, who is the envoy of the United States to Kiev now. But this has been rejected out of hand by the Russian government. So now it seems that Trump is drifting back towards the old Biden policy of promising more weapons, though whether he'll be able to deliver any is another question. But what do you see as the future here in terms of how could the war end, and what could be the future for a Ukrainian state now, given all of the difficulties that you've outlined for us in this discussion?
My main point that if war continues, Ukraine will turn into land without men, land without economy, land without infrastructure, land without young people, land without future. Even today, we see how many mothers are trying to save their sons and take them abroad before they turn 18 years old. Because after 18 years old, you are not allowed to leave the country. So even here, you can't even imagine how many young boys, basically 17 years old, 18 years old, from Lviv, relatively safe area. It's not Drushkivka, it's not Kramatorsk, it's not, Pokrovsk, it's not Sumy nowadays. Lviv, Frankivsk, Western Europe, very close to Poland. They bring their sons here because they don't believe in the future of Ukraine. And another sign, basically, that we mentioned, even political elites don't believe in Ukraine because they buy property outside of Ukraine. They send their sons outside of Ukraine and even daughters. They are educated here in US. I have students from Ukraine, as well. And they belong to political elites, to their fathers are persecutors in Ukraine, are judges in Ukraine, are politicians in Ukraine. They are not businessmen, actually, business people. So I don't believe that Ukraine have a bright future at all. I'm very pessimistic in this regard because why? Because based on those statements from the Western political elites, what we learn, they want Ukraine keep fighting. Why? To sell weapon, to sell death, to make money and profit from this war, and at the same time to, German generals say, "Oh, we need a war at least until 2029 or 2030 to rearm, to prepare for the future possible threat." The same we see from Poland, the same similar statements we see from other countries. So basically, they are open about their plan. We want Ukraine to keep dying. We want them to keep dying. Yeah, we will blood Russia. We will harm Russia by Ukraine hands. We don't want our sons to, ripped up by the drones and killed, No, Ukrainians can go. That's why we don't see many materials in Western legacy media and corporate media about forced mobilization, about people who are killed. Today, the first news I opened, when I woke up, the person was killed by newly mobilized men, was killed by draft officers, beaten to the death. Why? They kept him, they kidnapped him from the street. They performed fake medical examination, and of course he was declared fit to the military service. But nobody from commanders want to accept him. Why? Because he was alcoholic, and nobody was this kind of soldier in his units. So basically, he's not fit to the military service at all. But draft officers have quotas. They should fulfill these quotas, or they will be sent to the front line themselves. That's why they are hunting men. They this man was beaten to the death and he died. couple days later, he just died. And this another, Orban, this guy with double citizenship. So we have numerous cases of this, beaten man to the death. These men who are kept in, basement in draft centers, and they are denied clean water, medical treatment, medical help, their advocates are not allowed to provide them with some legal support. And this is all against, the law is against Ukraine constitution. It's a human rights violation. But the West keeps silent. Do you hear, except Orban, some members of political elites in the West who are concerned, who express concern about people killed by draft officers? No, we don't see that. So Europe want to keep bleeding Russia by Ukraine's hands. They will do whatever they want to keep Ukraine fighting. But I believe that Trump will steadily go away from this war. Because nowadays we see these, many MAGA members, even very prominent, like Tucker Carlson, like other, prominent supporters of Trump, who basically advocated him, who promoted him, are so disappointed. They said, we didn't vote for more weapons to Ukraine and to prolong this forever unwinnable war. And many people in the circles of Trump are not happy with this politics. Even if, he assured that, the West we will profit from this war now, Europe will buy our weapon. And so the next couple of days, what we see, Italy, France said, no, we will not buy your weapon. So what? Many people don't want U.S. engage in this forever war outside of U.S. because it's damaging. We witness here. I'm here. I was shocked by the problem with, drugs here. How many people, are suffering from these drugs? Approximately 100,000 people annually died from overdose. Americans have so many internal problems, and people are pointing on these problems, and they don't want to send more weapons to this Ukraine. Recently, I entered some cafe, and the guy asked me, where are you from? And when I said Ukraine, he don't even know where Ukraine is. And I asked him, do you know that your taxes are going to Ukraine, that you are financing this war, you are financing the pensions of our judges and prosecutors, which are enormously high. You are, from your taxes, 10.5 Ukrainian pensioners receive their pensions from your taxes, and you don't even know where Ukraine is on the map. And many experts in the surroundings of Trump, they really believe that interests of U.S. lie in the Middle East mostly, and in this, so they should more take care about China and relationship with China. And in order to improve those relationships, they should deal with Russia in more moderate way. So I don't believe that Trump. There are many people in Ukraine, I witness there. So they really believe, and they wish mostly, it's the wishful thinking. They believe that Trump will turn to this Biden-style politics, that he will be very furious, that Putin is disagreeing with him. So they are relying on his macho, on his machism, on his, this fragile masculinity. They are relying on this, and they, often repeat this peace through strengths. Yeah, they want Trump to be, to show his, masculine features and strengths. But in his surrounding, in his team, many people don't believe that Russia is a threat. Threat for them is a drug overdose, grocery prices, rent prices, enormous rent prices. U.S. has so many internal problems, including, illegal immigration that was pointed out, by MAGA. So Russia is not an existential threat for American people. And it's very difficult to explain why you have no money to buy a house, but your taxes are still going to fund forever unwinnable war with nuclear state. And another, as I told you, many people here are really afraid of nuclear war because they understand that Putin is crazy, real crazy man, and he will use whatever means to keep Ukraine in his sphere of influence. He's obsessed with Ukraine. It's not like Finland or Sweden. They entered NATO, but for him, it's not, it's a problem. Yeah, now it's just another security problem, but it's not existential threat. For him, Ukraine is a vital point. You know, for him to keep Ukraine is so important. And I'm sure that, based on his, he's a war criminal and he's sadist. For me, he's very, very sadistic. Yeah. And because, when Putin is saying, Kiev regime is perpetrated genocide of Russian speaking people. So I must say that in past 3 years, most of Russian speaking people were died as a result of Russian attack. Yeah, because most of those regions hit by Russian rockets and missiles live in the eastern regions of Ukraine or south regions of Ukraine, which are Russian-speaking regions. And many of my friends, many of my relatives are Russian-speaking, and many of them are not happy with Russian soldiers in Ukraine. But for Russia, they will use all these means, I believe, including nuclear power, in order to keep Ukraine in their sphere of influence. For Russia, nowadays, for Putin's Russia, let's say, in this stage of development, it's a security threat. NATO in Ukraine or Ukraine is NATO is considered as a security threat. So people who advocate more war and forever war should go to the front line and send their sons and taste the war, because it's not a video game like many people perceive this. Those people are real people, yeah, with real feelings, with real wishes, and who want to raise their children and live in peace and not die and not to experience this, sweet death for Mother Ukraine.
Well, Marta, thank you for the in-depth answer to that question. There, it's clearly something which is this war. Unfortunately, I think will go on because there are just simply too many people in very powerful positions inside London, Paris, Berlin, and Washington who want it to go on. Kit, before we close out the interview, do you have anything more to add on these questions?
No, not particularly. I just think that in general, I mean, I think
I do think that actually that this is, I mean, from my own reading on this, that I don't think that the aversion to Ukraine's NATO membership or being enrolled in the kind of Western fold, as it were, is unique to Putin at all. And I think that, I mean, you mentioned earlier that there were there are examples of U.S. officials discussing this. I think it was Bill Burns, who was Joe Biden's CIA chief in 2008 in the wake of Ukraine's NATO membership action plan being put into effect. He cabled Condoleezza Rice to say there is no issue in Russian politics that unites Russians more than Ukraine's NATO membership, and this includes, Putin's sharpest liberal critics. So, yeah, I mean, I for one reason or other, I concur with Alex that I think this is just going to it will continue and continue. But aside from that, no, I think again we're grateful for your perspective and insight. And we greatly thank you for joining us today, Marta. Stay safe, please.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
All right. Well,
I will
yeah. Thank you for joining us today, Marta. And as the situation evolves, we would love to have you back on to hear your perspective again sometime in the future if you'd be willing to join us again.
Yes. Yeah, of course.
Thanks very much.
All right. God bless you, Marta. Take care.
Take care.